CARBON6CSA is the first community-sponsored agriculture business model in the greenhouse gas mitigation sector. The CSA is a liaison connecting farmers to subscribers. 6 principles embody CARBON6CSA farms: regenerative, sustainable, caretaking, neighborliness, diversity, and honoring the history and legacy of land, also known as place. This is my farm story. Throughout, you will see the 6 principles of CARBON6CSA farms identified. Learn more at www.carbon6csa.com. Thank you. My name is Levi Lyle. I grew up on the farm here in Keota, and I've been farming for about 10 years. After graduating from high school, I moved away for a number of years and went to college and had a professional job elsewhere while my wife and I got married and started our family. And both of our families are from this area, so about a decade ago we moved back, and I got more involved in the farm operation with my father. I farm about 250 acres, and that's corn and soybeans, that rotation is pretty set. You know, we usually don't do corn on corn or anything. We are just grain farmers, so we don't have the livestock aspect to our farm, over the years, much of the ground that my family has farmed has been leased ground, and so that's led to kind of an interesting dynamic as we've seen much of that ground sell over the last few years. And so when I moved back here 10 years ago, I could see that we were going to become smaller and smaller farmers, because what we own amounts to about 80 acres as a family. And so I could see that we were going to be smaller farmers, so I began searching out more niche types of agriculture that led me toward organic, and I suppose some of that will come up throughout this interview, but that's been something that has been a direction that we've been going towards also. Some of the soil health practices that we use are, I have to kind of draw my attention to what those are, because we've used some of them for 25 years. So I guess you might want to know that we've been no-till all of the last 25 years since I was in about junior high. My dad went no-till, and so we don't even think of that as a soil health practice. That's just regular farming, you know. So there's a lot of no-till that goes on in this region of Iowa. But in recent years, say the last 5 years, we've begun to use cover crops. There were a few producers in our area that have been cover cropping with primarily rye or wheat for a decade or 2 decades, but it's only been in the last 5 years or so that more farmers have begun to use those practices. Interestingly enough, where we're located at in southeast Iowa, in Washington County and Keota County, we're basically right on the border between those 2 counties where we're at here at our home. But those 2 counties have led the state in the amount of cover crop acres, and that's primarily due to the incentivization of NRCS programs and the work of our NRCS people to go out and seek the money for watershed programs to do cover cropping and other associated practices like building terraces and wetlands and things like that. So we're very fortunate to be in this area of the state, and so for all the farmers in this area, that's been a real bonus, you know, because covering the cost of doing a new practice that you're not certain of is something that is intimidating. And so I hear about that when I talk to farmers. Organic farming is an interesting aspect that I've brought into our farm. I have 40 acres of organic certified farming. That's, I suppose, maybe a fifth of all of my farming acres. So I wanted to get into something more niche. I knew it was going to be necessary because I could see that absentee landowners that have not lived in this area for more than a generation were probably going to liquidate their asset, and we weren't going to be able to buy that land. So I sought to be organic, and my father, who's very supportive of the ideas I bring to the farm, was a little bit skeptical, mainly because he said, "Are you sure you want to sit on the cultivator all summer long?" And I was in junior high when the practice of row cultivation sort of ended in the Midwest, when Roundup was invented, and we put the cultivators in the barn and stopped cultivating. I had gotten in on a little bit of that, and Dad said I couldn't keep from plowing out the corn, so that was kind of a joke between us. But so I needed to show my dad that I was serious about using these kinds of practices, and so I sought to become the most knowledgeable I could, and so I became an organic inspector. And so for 2 years I was traveling around southeast Iowa on many farms that are mostly row crop farms, and I learned as much as I could about organic farming. One of the things that I saw immediately was that farmers were very frustrated with the soybean part of their rotation. I could see that the multiple trips through the field, from working the soil before they planted to managing the soybean crops with row cultivation, was very frustrating, because often they would still have a very affected yield in their soybeans due to the weed pressures. And so there was this concept of roller crimping that I had read about a decade earlier, before I was even back on the farm. And I thought it was kind of a pipe dream, it sounded like an interesting practice, but I just wasn't on the farm, so I didn't know how practical it really was. So what I decided to do was buy a roller crimper and start using it and sharing it with other farmers in the area. And what I found was that we were able to manage weeds, completely suppressing them. And in the transition of my 40 acres to organic, I had clean beans. It was a little bit unbelievable to see how the biomass was able to inhibit weeds. So this is rye biomass that we rolled down when we planted the soybeans. And when I did that over 3 years ago, in that transition to organic, it was really attention gathering. I mean, there were many people interested to see what was going on out there, and then to learn that we weren't using herbicides and still had clean beans was really an interesting thing that got some attention around the country and some farm magazines and things. So I guess that maybe is what has led to me being part of this interview today. I feel like I represent a lot of people in our area that are using practices and seeing benefits in cover crops. So the roller crimping is an additional aspect that is a little more unique. In this area, there's not a lot of roller crimping going on, but I lease my roller crimpers out to 10 or 15 people every year that are traveling, sometimes from Illinois or Nebraska, 4 hours away, or Missouri, to get a first experience using a roller crimper. And using it primarily on rye cover crops is the way that we use it. So all of this I'm saying in response to a question about organics. So organic was the starting point of using rye cover crops to grow, to roll down and suppress weeds with a roller crimper. But what we've begun doing is using the roller crimper on our conventional acres also. And so we'll put 2 bushels an acre of rye on in the fall, and then we'll roll it down in the spring and just skip the pre-emergent pass with our herbicides, with the option of coming in July and still using a herbicide. And for improving the yield, it appears that isn't really necessary, but aesthetics is an important part of our culture around farming. And so I have gone in and used a herbicide pass in July on the conventional acres where I roller crimp. So we're saving costs and the rolling down of rye also. Profitability drives much of our decisions on the farm. In college, I was a major in biology with an emphasis in environmental science. So I suppose that personal interest kind of leads me into the biology of the soil and an interest in it. And I'm a believer in the impact of having a diverse soil. So I was excited about the conservation part. But where the conversation transitions from profitability and conservation into other things that really drive me to have these kinds of practices on my farm, it kind of hands off to what I see as the way I want my family to be involved in the farm. So having my children with me in the combine or in the tractor when I'm planting in the spring is a big part of what makes farming so enjoyable. And if I can't have the kids with me because I'm using seeds that have coatings on them for insecticides and things, then that's kind of a downer for me. And it's been just a big bonus to be able to have the kids with me and tell them they can touch the seed on the organic acres and things. And so for me, beyond the profitability and the conservation, that's a big part of why I'm interested in these practices. Some of the assistance that I've received from NRCS are in multiple forms. I have CSP contracts, Conservation Stewardship Program, I think is the acronym, but those programs provides some incentivization to do conservation. Things like putting on cover crops, splitting our application of nitrogen into the spring, so when we plant the crop, and then mid-season, versus the alternative, which would be falling hydrous. So they incentivize those. We do a stalk nitrate test during the corn growing season, and so those are parts of CSP. And then there's an EQIP program within NRCS where I did an extended rotation, adding wheat into my rotation as I transitioned. And that's kind of a story. I ended up doing rye instead because of the way the season went. But a buffer on the border of the field, and of course, and no-till. Well, I was going to say, of course, no-till, but actually that wouldn't be assumed, because as I transitioned to organic, doing no-till organic soybeans is rather rare, but that's the practice I described earlier that I've had great success with. So I was able to include that no-till aspect in that EQIP program contract. So those are a few of the contracts. Also, we have a watershed project in our area that's in Washington County and Keota County, and that watershed project provides farmers with other incentives for using cover crops, and so I was able to participate in those programs and still am. A buffer strip is a practice where instead of planting your field all the way up to the fence row or the road, you leave a space. So what I did was leave 30 feet of an alfalfa mix that grew, and that program is a 3-year program in which you wouldn't grow corn on that buffer, I believe, for a decade, but you can't do anything with it for the 3-year period. And so as an organic farmer, that's awesome, because as you come to the end of a field with row cultivation on corn, you often run over a whole bunch of corn on the end rows. So it makes your field look cleaner, and as I mentioned, aesthetics is something that farmers take note of as they drive by and look at each other's crops. So that's just kind of maybe an extra thing. But that buffer is important for also herbicide drift. In organic production, a farmer must have a protective buffer around his crop. There's multiple ways to do that. A farmer could manage the outside border of their field with organic practices, but then when they harvest it, keep it separate. So that hopper in the combine will just go in with conventional grain or to feed for animals. But this takes the guesswork out of it because you don't have to have that parallel production, you call it, where you've got your non-organic crop right next to your organic. A buffer really cleans up the record keeping and makes it easier to manage an organic field. From an agronomic or conservation aspect, the practices of cover cropping that we use have a profound effect. The research that we see from our region of the state indicate that farmers can have an increase in soil carbon of 0.1 or 0.2% per year. So within a decade, they can increase the soil carbon from say 3.5% to 4.5%, which is a pretty typical rating for organic carbon in our soil. And another decade goes by, and now they've increased their carbon a full 2%. And so farmers that have been cover cropping in our area for multiple decades have that data on their farms, and it's incredible to be able to see that data and know it's there. So in my case, where I haven't been cover cropping very long, I just move forward with confidence that is happening out there. So we don't have the data yet in the short years we've been doing it. But where I roller crimp down the rye, that mat of rye remains the entire season and is still there in the fall. And then as I was transitioning to organic, we went in and we applied manure that had been injected by dragline on that rolled down rye. And that was really interesting because we didn't know for sure if it was just going to drag rye all over the field. It was the possibility of it was kind of frightening. And we also didn't know in combining the beans if we were going to drag rye biomass all over the field. But what we found was, in both cases, the rye stayed put. The rye had been rolled down and left intact with the ground, and you could move that rye aside with your fingers in the fall and just see that underneath it was just lush with busy earthworms. And so those observations are incredible to see, and it gives me confidence. The conservation practices that we're using with cover cropping have been interesting because you can take that rye mat that is there all season long and still there in the fall, and you can pull it back and you can really see that underneath it is biology. The earthworms are there and very busy, and it's just incredible to see that actual presence of biology in the soil. When you roller crimp, you lay down the rye and it stays intact with the soil, and that's important because that allows the rye to terminate slowly, which is the reason it provides suppression of weeds all season long in an organic practice. But that caused some worry on our farm because we didn't know if that rye mat was, number one, going to get caught by the sickle and the soybean head on the combine and drag, and make it difficult to combine. What we found was that it doesn't bother the combine. It's close to the ground and the soybeans can be harvested with no problems. The other thing that we saw was in the fall when we used injection manure that was on a drag line. So this manure business uses hoses that they can pull up to a mile away from a hog confinement building, and we used this source of manure, and we were kind of worried that the drag lines from the hoses would pull rye all over the field and mess up the field, but we were pleasantly surprised that we were able to use the injection manure and not mess up the rye mat that was out there. And so that was really something that I became excited about, and the farmers realized that these types of things are not additional variables or issues, then maybe they'll see that roller crimping rye is something that works on their farm. We monitor the improvements of the soil through soil testing, which happens every couple of years. So the soil testing that are pretty standard in farming is that the N, P, and K, which is the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium, is tested every few years, and then amendments are made accordingly. Also, the soil organic matter is measured as part of those studies, and the soil pH and things like that that are more complicated than I understand. So soil testing is an important part of our farming, and that is true whether it's an organic farm or a conventional farm. But we do those things on our farms as well. Some of the challenges when we began looking into using cover crops were related to having the equipment. Um, I I guess I kind of pridefully joke with my dad that when I moved back here, I said, "Dad, we need to go pick up a 750 John Deere drill at the local auction, because this is going to be a big deal." And we didn't. And within a couple of years, it became impossible to find a 750 drill that was 20 years old, unless you were willing to pay the price for a new one, because they're an item that farmers seek to have now with cover cropping. So we eventually did acquire a drill, and that's an important part of getting the cover crops on. And now farmers are using bigger and bigger drills, and so it's been an additional boost to our local economy. There's farmers that have focused on the cover cropping side of things and are doing it custom for people. So seeing that part of it is an interesting part also, how additional businesses are forming around the cover crop industry and such. But another aspect is, specifically when you roller crimp, you need to make sure that you have sharp equipment. So when you are planting your crop, you have to have seed openers on your drill, or on your planter or drill, that are have a sharp cutting edge, and you can't downplay that. It's really important, because if you can't get your soybeans into the ground, they're just going to lay on the surface, and then you're frustrated, and you can't blame it on the cover cropping. It's that there are aspects to the equipment management that come into play when you're doing a new type of system like this. So we had some learning curves when it comes to the equipment and getting the seeds in the ground, figuring out the right rate to use when we're putting on cover crops. Also adjusting the population of our soybeans. The data coming out of Madison, Wisconsin, its organic program, suggests that farmers use an amazing 220,000 seeds per acre when planting soybeans in a roller crimping system. So that would be on 30-inch rows. And so that made my father's jaw drop. Like, why would you use that kind of population on 30-inch rows? Well, so I talked him into using 180,000 seeds and pushing that up to 200 as we went across the 40 acres the first time we roller crimped and planted into that. And what we found was, as we increased the populations, the weed pressure was less and less. So having a higher population of soybeans takes away some of the variable of those soybeans coming through the rye mat, but also having them come through quickly because of a higher population really helps inhibit the weeds. And so now we just plant 200,000 seeds per acre, and don't second guess it in the roller crimping system, because we know that is valuable. So the benefits to the farm profitability is there. When we roller crimp, we save on the cost of herbicide passes. So whether we're talking about organic or conventional, it's the same conversation. I bought my own sprayer a few years back and began doing my own spraying, so I could have better control on our farm of when I want to spray and that kind of thing. And it's been nice, because in a roller crimping system, on conventionals, I can go in July and maybe just spray parts of the field if I am going to spray. So the fuel cost savings is another aspect of roller crimping and planting at the same time. That's something that is kind of a more specific practice that we use, but we put the roller crimper on the front of our tractor, and then we have a 15 foot drill that we plan at the same time. Actually, I shouldn't say drill. We don't drill our soybeans into our roller crimp dry. We have 15-inch rows. The research strongly encourages 30-inch rows on a roller crimping setup, and the reason they say that is in case a farmer needs to go in for a row cultivation, a high residue row cultivation pass. It gives them a plan B, but we're on 15-inch rows on our 15-foot soybean drill. So we have saved costs, I guess is what I'm getting at, by doing it at the same time. Some of the resilience to the extremes in weather, let me just think about. So we've been seeing more extremes in weather in the recent years. When I think about using cover crops and building conservation into our operation, I think about the resilience in the soil. I've wanted and I've played around with using more species in my cover crop mix. Using 10 or 12 species in the cover crop mix is indicated in the research to have profound effects on bringing the biology of the soil to life, and that can it can improve the yield and decrease the pests, diseases. So I feel strongly that research is there and will benefit our farm, but I wrestle with it a little bit because I've played around with interseeding these multiple species mixes in a corn crop, and there are species that are ideal because they don't get too aggressive, but they also using species that will winter kill would be beneficial in that interseeded corn crop. And the reason I wrestle with it, number one, is because it costs money to put it out there, and in some of my experimentation of it, it ends up that it hasn't amounted to very much in the fall. When I thought it was really going to explode in the fall, after we take the corn crop out, sometimes there's not that much there. But I'm not going to quit playing with it because I think it could really have a profound impact on our farming operation. Another reason I wrestle with it, though, is because in cover cropping, we think of our rye cover crop as kind of a mono cover crop, and as far as creating biomass that then can suppress weeds that next spring when we're growing soybeans, it works really good just to have that rye cover crop. If we start mixing in other species, it's hard to know whether the maturity dates of them are all going to align in a way that allows you to roll them down simultaneously. It's unlikely that oats or barley or wheat are going to mature at that critical point in time at the very end of May to then roll them all down together. That's probably not practical thinking. So figuring out how our rotation could be adapted to include multiple species in our cover crops is an important thing I hope to kind of figure out on our farm. Weather events is something that we're just going to see more of, it sounds like. So these strong weather events are a place where the cover crops can really come into play. We had such a unique season in 2019. Farmers in our county did not plant corn in May. We planted corn in April, mid-April, late April, and then we planted corn June 2nd. And for the month of May, it was just too wet to plant any corn. And I think I could say that has never happened before in 150 years, probably. I mean, it was an unusual spring. So that leads to a thinking about the future. You know, do we need to plan on growing shorter season corn? Do we need to plan on having a way to get cover crops in earlier by interseeding them or flying them on? Because farmers in this area of the state are on board with cover cropping. They're very excited about using cover crops because we see the impact in our fields in a pretty short period of time. But it's been frustrating for people to put them on and have them sit because they got on too late in the fall to really grow. And then it's spring when they grow. Now, I've done some things on my farm that I think kind of put that into perspective, where we seeded on rye at 2 bushels an acre, knowing we were going to roller crimp it down and plant soybeans that next spring. I was frustrated too the year before last when the rye didn't even germinate in the fall. But then when spring came, using that rate of rye allowed it to still be 2 foot tall, which maybe it would have been 4 foot or 5 foot tall if I had more growth out of my rye in the fall. But it was 2 foot tall, and I roller crimped it down and skipped my pre-emergent pass and herbicides, and I was able to benefit from that cover crop in that way. So I don't think farmers need to be frustrated with not seeing growth in the fall. If it's out there, it's still going to have a profound impact even in the springtime, and it can lead to a lot of biomass generation. The question as to whether the benefits of these practices are worth the cost is an easy one for me. So we save money by putting on the cover crops. The costs that are associated with putting on the cover crops, I feel like we are generating income for young farmers who are excited to sell cover crop seed, which is an industry in agriculture that didn't exist a decade ago. So now there's cover crop seed that can be grown, number one, and it can be cleaned up by seed cleaners, and it can be seeded by people who want to focus on that part of their farming. So to me, the profitability and the cost benefit on my own farm stands on its own, but even if it didn't stand on its own, I can see an economic impact in our local farm economy by doing it. So it's an easy decision for me. So some of the advice that I have to farmers considering implementing these practices are to start small, to do small experiments in your fields. I have tried to put some stuff on YouTube on my experiments, so they don't just, because some of my experiments that have been bad experiments have, I'm hoping end up beneficial to somebody. So some examples of those, I'll just say, I put a YouTube video out there that if somebody puts my name in and roller crimping, some of this stuff comes up. But I roller crimped Austrian winter peas that had grown into a nice biomass, and I rolled them down thinking that that could be my roller crimped crop that I grow corn into. And that had limited success. I did that and did not supplement with any additional nitrogen on 1 acre. And the results of that were that I had corn that raccoons were very, very interested in. So it was like, even though that was a plot of traded GMO corn, it must have been sweet like sweet corn, because the raccoons just went crazy on it. And so the yield of that did not amount to very much. And so that was just something that I'd made mental note of. I don't know where to take that experiment from there, but it was something that I had heard about, that Austrian winter peas as a legume could fixate the nitrogen that could be rather significant, up to 200 pounds an acre could be fixated. And so that's all the nitrogen a corn crop would need. And it's part of that roller crimping system that needs more research, but we at least saw we could grow the biomass in Austrian winter peas and roll it down and plant our corn into it. So, and the corn emerged just fine. So your original question was, how should farmers start out with doing these kinds of practices? They should experiment in small ways on their farms as they're getting into it. Some additional resources that I'd like to just make sure people know about are, for example, a resource called Comet Farm, which is at Colorado State University. So this is a USDA resource that has been developed to help farmers calculate the amount of carbon that they're sequestering on their farm. And I've found that resource to be useful, and it's a nonprofit resource through the USDA. So I would like to use that resource along with some of the satellite data that's on Google Earth. There's a satellite image filter called NDVI. NDVI allows you to see the amount of photosynthetic activity that is on your farm, and a person could use that satellite data to actually see how well their cover crops are growing. Using the NDVI satellite data on Google Earth, I have observed that at the end of May, when our rye cover crop is at its highest point, 4 or 5 foot tall, you could see on a nice line graph on that Google data that there's biomass at a certain rate there. And then when we roll it down to terminate it, then during the month of June, that line graph comes down, and then as the corn crop would grow, or in this case it was a soybean crop, you could see that line go back up. So that satellite data, I think, is gonna be the start of something. There's gonna continue to be more development in those technologies that make it possible for farmers to really validate what they're doing out there, and with that, I think, will come the carbon market. There has been a source of funding that I've been able to resource through a bigger umbrella, USDA money, that supports farmers through value-added producer grants, and the one that is more local is Iowa's Specialty Crop Block Grant. And there's also a federal grant of that category. But money in these categories have allowed me to participate with Iowa State Extension to do research on some fruit crops that is up and coming. Some of those fruit crops are pawpaw fruit, persimmon fruit, honeyberries, also known as haskap. These fruit crops are not necessarily on the top list of people's potential commodities in our area, but they are crops that have great potential to be developed in niche agriculture. And additional things that I have moved into that are profitable on my farm are growing sour cherries, which are dwarf sour cherries, selections that come out of Canada that are well adapted to the Midwest, and also Aronia berries. I have developed markets in these things that are pretty local. I can take them as fresh fruit to local food co-ops and health food stores, and even ship them to larger metropolitan areas like Minneapolis, and I have markets for these fruit crops. Sometimes I give presentations at regional organic conferences or local foods conferences, or like Practical Farmers of Iowa is a really supportive organization in our area to help farmers find that kind of profitability on their farm. But my presentations at these conferences are related to talking about these niche types of products that can be grown on the farm. Every type of fruit that I named is a perennial fruit, so I got into thinking of perennial fruit crops a number of years ago because I was well, it's interesting to talk about, actually, because I was moving in that direction because I had just moved back to the farm, and I didn't have the ability to make farm management decisions because my dad's healthy and strong, and at 65 years old he plans to farm another 20 years, so I was thinking, well, if dad's going to continue to make all the farming decisions for a number of years, then I'll find this little thing I can do in the corners of the field that can be my thing. So that was kind of my thinking process at the beginning, but that has led to growing these perennial fruits and being excited about their place in our conservation practices. Perennial fruit crops are interesting because the management tends to be very little. The ability to do it organically is there. There are ways that these things can be managed and done without pesticides and herbicides. And also the ability to stop erosion and have conservation in the soil is incredible when you have a perennial crop that can have grass all around it. So these practices could be used in tricky spots where the ground may otherwise have erosion. So that's where they fit into my farm practices. This past year, I purchased an implement called a weed zapper. A weed zapper is an implement that uses high voltage electricity to electrocute weeds. It is something that at first catches my attention because organic farmers are looking for alternative things to use instead of herbicides. But I used my weed zapper this year, which is a 20-foot implement that mounts on the front of the tractor and has a generator that is PTO driven on the back of the tractor. And it uses high voltage electricity to electrocute the weeds that are above the soybean canopy. So this past season in July and August, I used the weed zapper on 800 acres locally. So most of those acres were, I'll say 50% of those acres were organic and 50% were conventional, non-GMO soybeans. So farmers, I don't want to speak too specifically. So this practice I initially thought was an excellent opportunity for organic farmers to get better management in their soybean weeds. But then I got some calls from some non-GMO soybean producers that said that they're having trouble finding the herbicides to take care of the weeds in their field. So we began using the weed zapper on non-GMO fields, or on soybean fields. But then some farmers that just have traditional GMO soybeans called, and so they were interested in using it. So we're using it across a range of environments, and if I could just bring my point to a conclusion, it's that electricity works to kill weeds. Things that are very succulent, like water hemp or ragweed or mare's tail, are terminated very easily using electricity. And so that's something that I think is going to be coming down the pike. Some of the larger equipment manufacturers have called me because they heard that this was a practice that we were using, and so I think that there's interest in the larger equipment manufacturers to figure out, okay, what kind of tractors are going to optimize the power output to run these PTO generators to electrocute weeds. So stay tuned, I think. I'll provide a link below to the coalesced USDA video when it becomes available. That's a shorter version of what you just saw. Join me on the patreon.com website, which is also in the description below. Also, my book of farm poetry, titled Ice Sage, Living and Loving the Land Poems, is available on Amazon and other retail outlets. Thank you.